Well.
Hello.
Hello, Andrea. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you as well.
We might have crossed paths ever so briefly in DC. Fall.
Yes.
Right. It was
Were you running around with Vanilla or John Hessler?
Yeah, that guy.
Yes, I do remember that. Yeah.
The rock star of the world down there, his little empire.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was an awesome class.
Yeah.
Loved
My new Facebook friend.
it. Was launched me on all kinds of tangents.
Yeah. He's a bright, good boy.
He sure is.
Yeah.
Apparently he says he comes up to Philly every so often, so.
He goes everywhere every so often.
Italy.
Yes,
Everywhere.
That's good to see you.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to
And
this.
I'm anxious to talk about the capabilities.
How are you?
Oh, both of you.
Say hello. He's not staying.
He's not staying?
I'm staying.
If he's not staying, I'm not talking to him, okay? I'm not talking to him.
He's dead to me.
He's dead. He's dead. And you know why? I told you, my friends don't want to pay money.
I don't know. Steve.
Some of your friends have jobs that they need to go to. I'm delighted. I'm glad we're
Thank you
I'm
very
Ron.
much. Congratulations on your fellowship.
Thank you.
And residency.
Sorry, reserve.
No, not at all. One's for you.
Where to go?
Oh, good idea. Good idea.
It's called the Val England Arts Foundation. I'm going
Right, duh. Russell Maret. I'm there in August. Andrea.
I know about Andrea.
Okay.
When are you going?
Yes.
I'm going in 2 weeks. Oh, no kidding. Wow. But I've been
This is
there. Oh, you've been
The
there.
director.
Oh, yeah. I'm one of the directors. It's a long,
Yeah, it's a long
complicated
story.
You have other things
Yeah.
that are more worthy of your brain space.
No, I'll do that
But
for you.
you'll have a wonderful time.
He's a very good printmaker.
Okay. Great. Well, yeah, well, I look forward to seeing you there. Maybe when you'll have in August.
Yeah, the month, the first.
Yeah, very good. Yeah. Pretty sure it's the 31st. And are you coming back? Are you?
I'm actually dying.
Alice and John made it look better than anybody.
Is that when you did your first public? No, Ireland.
My latest book is Seven Solid Bones. Yeah. The whole. Yes.
Great. I'm gonna go to work.
Thank you for stopping by.
Nice
Nice to see you.
Yep.
What's the
All right, thanks. See you.
Things good here?
Oh, you mean like in like?
Yeah.
Yeah. I got upgraded to reference librarian now, so I'm not in the library.
Good for you.
So I got a full-time job as reference librarian. I'm still at the college.
Yeah, we were talking about you the other day, actually, because my head of the reading room, Russell Maret, trained at the National Library of Medicine. So I was asking him what you got to work that Stands on her own. She is a woman, hear her roar.
Library Congress.
See you.
I mean, we could either
We're taking money at the moment, allocating people first.
well, it doesn't have my notes in it.
The way you're holding that, so
You have to hold it for
this way, I think they were just worried that I was so
Yeah, you have
It's okay. I'm Russell. Yeah, good. How's it going? Yeah. Have you been able to find a place where you can work on your budget?
no.
Right. I saw it on Instagram. Yeah, good. I'll get with the backup with more
Oh, sure.
studios.
Okay. Oh, why is that? Okay.
I'm really just here as Mr. Dimunation's assistant. His IT guy, which is a big mistake. They're doing it.
I'm not worried. I just want to walk over there and just take
Right. I once again have a video that's to start other than me. There's one time I was speaking at the show, like that's my IT assistant. And the whole, like, every 5 minutes I had to say, yeah, he couldn't remember what he was supposed to do.
Have a hand sign.
Right. Okay, glad you could come. Right, we just met. I service. You know, here's the thing about wines. Overcome many times Amish.
You're Amish.
Yeah. Reform.
Reform Orthodox.
With the guy who's my equipment brought an assistant once, and they're all Mennonite Amish guy. He left
Like a silent
Amish and became Mennonite because he really wanted to drive trucks. Yeah.
The basis of faith.
University Arts, the water main break. In the building, 14 feet of water. Luckily, the student just were high enough, but the city shut down the building, and the students weren't allowed in. Yeah, and they had 1 week left to finish their.
Did they make a temporary project?
Well, no, I mean, it was, you're far enough along, and I think it was interesting because it's the most crucial thing.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
But everybody was, yeah, which is, we're going to hear about a little bit.
I tell that story all the time.
Yeah. That's how the beginning of this talk is all about that.
It's a very memorable story.
Yeah,
And it also evokes it.
Right.
And of course, I always start off with, you have to know Russell to understand why this story gets told. Because you and I would probably choose 5 or 6 sheets of paper and then see how it goes. Because Russell is Russell, and Russell works. So let's just damn it all at once. And find out that it doesn't work.
Right. Although I would really throw myself into
Sometimes she's done it so many times, she has about 40 photos.
Right.
And at one dinner party, now I have all everybody else.
Oh, she's in hers. Got it.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Living Book. And Welcome. I'm so pleased to see so many people. I think we have about one seat left here, maybe two. So you are, it's so great to see a large and enthusiastic crowd. I'm Jim Green. I'm the librarian of the library company, and it's my pleasure to welcome you. Actually, I should first say that I welcome you on behalf of our director, Mike Barsanti, who really regrets that he can't be here today, and I'm sure he'll regret it even more when we tell him how much fun it was. He's at an unfun meeting of the Independent Research Libraries Association in Boston. So I want to start just by saying a few words about the exhibition, that is the pretext for this program, and about the people who put it together. So this exhibition, this is just, well, 3 words. This is a lovely exhibition. I think for those of you who've seen it, if you haven't seen it, you'll have some time to take a look. It is really lovely. And one of the nicest things about it, I think, apart from the books themselves, is the little introductory paragraph that if you haven't seen it, or even if you have, I just want to read it because I think it's so eloquent. People love books, it says. They are essential artifacts of human culture. Think about their physical and symbolic presence in our lives, not to mention the knowledge they contain. Books have evolved and continue to evolve in form and function. They are shaped, modified, and adapted by those who hold, read, or otherwise interact with them. Library company conservators have gathered a wide assortment of materials to present unique and fun perspectives on the book. You will find large books, small books, ugly books, beautiful books, silly books, and serious books, just to name a few. We highlight the many different roles books play in our lives as vessels of knowledge, memory, and culture. Books help us remember the past, record the present, and imagine the future. Long lives the living book. So, the conservators who put this exhibition together, this is an exhibition that was entirely done by our conservation staff, except for one important element, which I'll mention in a minute. Jennifer Woods Rosner, Alice Austin, and Andrea Krupp. And as they pointed out to me recently, I wasn't so surprised, but it's still kind of breathtaking. They, between them, have 87 years of experience working. 87 years, during which time I suppose they've probably looked at every book that we have and probably taken a few of them apart and put a few of them back together again, put them in boxes, but studied them too, in really in depth. They look at these things hard. We're very proud of the fact that our entire conservation staff are bookbinders, artists, and historians of the book. And this is, I think, really extraordinary. And I think it goes a long way towards explaining why they've been here for 87 years, too, because their jobs are a lot of fun. In fact, we all envy them. So they have picked, so what did they do? Our former librarian, Edwin Wolf, who hired 2 of us at least, right? Well, me and Jennifer and Andrea, Andrea too. Used to say that when you're putting up an exhibition, try to find books that make you go wow, and you call them wow books. And I think that, yes, there's a tremendous variety of different sizes and shapes of books here. There's something, every single book you look at here will be a little bit surprising to you, I think. They're not ordinary books, any of them. Every single one of them, this is what I imagine you guys have been doing all these years. You come across a book and you say, wow, or wow, or some version of that. And I think that's, and then being the scholars that they are, or the careful documenters that they are, maybe a little note. And when the time came, this is really their big moment to bring out all those wow books and put them together in a framework which which really helps you understand them better. But mostly, every single one of these books deserves to be looked at hard, and I think you'll agree it's pretty amazing. So, and then of course another thing the other person who helped with the exhibition is Conchetta Barbera here, who's also taking pictures of us. And she made the video that is such an important part of the exhibition. So actually, let me just say, can we give them all hands right now? course, they also picked our speakers, and they picked speakers who are people that represent some of the different perspectives that can be brought to this exhibition, and I think you'll be really pleased with both the variety and also the way they're going to work off of each other. So I'd like to get started with the main part of the program now and introduce our first speaker, Mark Dimunation. Mark Dimunation has been the chief of rare books and special collections, chief of the Rare Book and Special Collections Division at the Library of Congress since 1998. As chief, Mr. Dimunation is responsible for the development, interpretation, and management of the Rare Book collection, the largest collection of rare books in North America. He specializes in the 18th and 19th century English and American printing and has considerable experience working with antiquarian materials as well as fine press and contemporary artists' books. He is nearing completion of an extensive project to reconstruct Thomas Jefferson's library at the Library of Congress. He is currently on the faculty of the Rare Book School at the University of Virginia, where he teaches the history of the book as well as at Catholic University. He's a member of the Earlier Club and a fellow of the American Antiquarian Society. And Mark will speak to us on 10 Moments in the Stacks, a curator's view.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. I'd like to echo the sentiments regarding the exhibition. We call them gosh golly books, but it's the same thing at the Library of Congress. And the first reaction I think a curator or a librarian has when they walk into the exhibition, just walking down the hallway, I turned to Russell and said, "This is really good stuff." And I think at the heart of this exhibition is that experience of bumping into really good stuff when you live with a collection. So as it's been noted in the introduction to their exhibition, the library company conservators Alice Austin, Jennifer Rossmer, and Andrea Krupp sign off with the toast, "Long live the living book." Books, as we're told by the exhibition, are far more than mere objects. They are essential artifacts of human culture that have been shaped, modified, and adapted by all who have come in contact with them. They are a repository, if you will, of the myriad stories that are found in their wake. They are vessels of knowledge, they're mirrors of memory, and they're beacons of the future. Each, in their own fashion, has a story to tell. Collections have a story to tell as well. They are more than an accumulation of books. They're an anthology of stories, really. Today, as we celebrate this exhibition, we are also reminded that it's now our responsibility to carry these stories forward, to acknowledge the life that these particular books have had and how they came to live together. And even better, many of us with our own collections will soon have our own stories, our own moments with the collections that will tug at our curatorial hearts and shape the way in which our collections are transported into the imaginations of their viewers and their readers. We all have such stories. All you have to do is have a plate of pasta and 2 rare book librarians, and you have this, the talk is written already. In many ways, it's our personal interaction with the collection that brings us back to work every morning. It's a personal, sometimes delicate, and often emotional connection that evolves when a collection is placed in our care. Alice asked me to comment on the curatorial experience of working with collections, and I thought of no better way of detailing this than through the telling of some of my own stories, my own moments in the stacks. I don't think I'll forget this particular moment. It was the spring of 1998. I had just finished an exhausting first day, full day, as chief of rare books at the Library of Congress. I was anxious, I was excited, I was terrified. I was clutching at the idea that I needed something familiar to ground me, to make me feel like I belonged in this rather vast institution. I had arrived from Cornell University, where I was used, oddly, to a much larger facility and twice as many staff. At the end of my first day in Washington, I felt afloat in the enormity of the Grand Library. and puzzled by the tight terrain of the rare book reading room. I need to see the books, I thought. I need to see what this is all about. I entered the vault. It's a strange jumble of doorways and hallways. The books are tucked into a series of small rooms like some sort of monastic vault of treasures. I opened the first door. Thomas Jefferson. The next, Abraham Lincoln. The third, several hundred incunables. My excitement began to rise. I could feel the collection begin to fill in around the edges, up to the third floor, down the hall to the north room 34. I unlocked the door and pushed my way in. The opening of the door triggers lights that are on a slight delay. They flickered, and then suddenly they flashed full on, and there it was, the Rosenwald collection. As I walked the aisles of the room, I knew it had happened. My life had changed. All around me were monumental books, some of them familiar friends, others easily recognized, and many others books I had only ever read about. Great moments in typographic design, extraordinary examples of printing, iconic titles in science, literature, architecture, the arts, Galileo, Vesalius, Aldous, Redute, Blake. I was surrounded by the universe of the history of the book. Frankly, I was overcome by the books and by the vast responsibility that suddenly faced me. These books are mine, I thought. These are all my books. In one fashion or another, I have been working with antiquarian books for nearly 30 years now. The privilege really of becoming a custodian of library collections is on a daily basis. I'm allowed to work and play with extraordinary books and to share this experience with colleagues and scholars and interested readers. And as I've grown to know and appreciate these books, I've come to understand a few things. First and foremost, these books are mine. They're all my books, including this Gutenberg. I don't claim this just because I may have acquired some of them. It's more than that. As curators, we're called upon to become fluent with our collections. We need to know how the pieces mesh, how to contextualize the content and the object. We need to take this herd of disparate items and interpret them in such a way that they make sense to researchers. Lurking in my collection are thousands of items that have a story that warrants telling. Some are grand, some are mundane, but they give the collection life. And as I embrace the obligation to capture those stories and to keep them alive, I claim the books as well. These books are mine. They're all my books. By their very existence, libraries affirm a belief in the past that is in some measure knowable. When we work with rare books and special collections, our concern is to gather, preserve, and interpret physical materials that reflect culture and time. They can be monumental, they can be quite ordinary, but they contain evidence of the past. They are knowable. Our work is what my very famous predecessor, Frederick Goff, referred to as a personal destiny with the world of the past and the expectations and hope of the world to come. So I bring to this discussion that sense of personal destiny. In a formal sense, I'm addressing the meaning and the material reality of our collections and our responsibility to safeguard that tradition for future generations. I'm talking about those moments, in a more familiar term, those stories of our interaction with our collections that have altered our understanding of our books, our collections, and our work. Very soon after my arrival at the Library of Congress, the Librarian of Congress asked me to pull together a tabletop display, a dog and pony as we call it, of 15th century books. It was for a small group of visiting European libraries, he informed me, so just pull a couple of titles for each country. And I know that sounds rather nonchalant, but that's how we talk about our collection of incunables at the Library of Congress. Just go pull a couple of them. Well, I quickly pulled books from France and Italy and Germany, iconic titles. I was thrilled. I'd only been there less than a month and I was already playing with the good stuff. You know, Dutch books, Spanish books. It was all very heady. But I found myself freezing as I came across the last library that was listed, England. Well, those of us who live in this world understand that this is no small order. English incunables are not so easy to come by. I soon found myself standing in the Rosenwald collection, staring at a shelf, muttering to myself over and over until the enormity of the question finally registered. Which Caxton should I use? Which Caxton should I use? I had had maybe one or two scattered Caxtons throughout my entire previous career. Many colleagues of mine have never possessed one, and here I am asking myself which Caxton should I use, because I'm staring at 15 of them. Caxton, of course, is the first English person to work as a printer, and the first to introduce the printing press to England. He's also the printer of the first book printed in English, which he printed in Bruges, and also the first book printed in England, and introduced the press at Westminster in 1476. The first book known to have been produced at Westminster was the Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Here is Caxton's translation of the Golden Legend, in 1483, the Book of the Knight of the Tower from 1484, containing perhaps the earliest verses of the Bible to be printed in English. There was the Mirror of the World, the translation of Ovid's Metamorphosis. I was lost in what seemed to me a sea of Caxton. Romances, classical works, translations, English and Roman histories, all of them in crisp, clean, Rosenwald copies. It was a connoisseur collection. After selecting the items, I found one additional moment in the Caxton holdings. Paul Needham, a colleague of ours and a rather distinguished historian of the 15th century book, when working with the Rosenwald Caxtons in the 1980s, discovered that whenever he came to a break in the binding between gatherings, he could see some strips of paper with type on it, clearly Caxton type, and convinced the library, as Rosenwald would have been willing to do, to take the book apart to remove those strips so that he could unearth a previously unidentified Caxton indulgence, which he had written about in A Printer and a Partner. For me, it was simply opening a folder and saying, I wonder what this is, as I looked at a series of paper strips that had been removed from the binding, neatly placed together to recreate the indulgence that it had been cut from. Which Caxton should I use? Well, the librarian's office called again. Dublin, they said, would like to see James Joyce's Death Mask. Fine, I said. How can I help? Well, the silence on the line indicated that I wasn't participating properly in the conversation. Could you please bring it by the librarian's office? Panic. Death Mask? We have Joyce's Death Mask? Certainly, I said, gamely, trying to hide my terror. When is Dublin coming to D.C.? They're in my office right now. And so the search began. We shut down the reading room. My beloved colleague, Jerry Wager, who's no longer on this planet, and I began the frantic hunt for James Joyce's Death Mask. It meant dividing the stacks into various areas. It's familiar. Open every box. Do not assume that the label tells you what's in the box. We are going, and it's more than 1 million pieces that we're going through. Jerry and I focused on a particular room, a series of rooms that had been the domain of a previous colleague who in his last few years was suffering from an ailment that caused him to make interesting and creative decisions as to what to do with materials. He hid them to make them safe. So we found ourselves panicking as we went box by box through the entire Library of Congress collection, knowing that there was Dublin in the librarian's office. Well, what were we looking for? A fake Joyce death mask had been offered for sale at Sotheby's. And the National Library had almost acquired this until its authenticity was questioned. And the plaster of Paris mask that was bought and then returned to Sotheby's emerged to only be a second or third generation copy of what had been the death mask that had been made in 1941. Sotheby's had a full and thorough history of this in their catalog, speaking of 3 original masks made in January 13th, 1941. They were now in 3 venues, they said: the Joyce Foundation in Zurich, the James Joyce Tower in Dublin, Sandy Cove, and the Rare Book and Special Collections Division at the Library of Congress. I can't explain to you the nerve-making experience of wandering shelf by shelf, but Jerry and I found ourselves finally coming to the last shelf in this colleague's room. If it wasn't here, we were really in trouble. And we could see each other through the stacks, through the shelves, as we were going down, down, down. And then all of a sudden, in unison, both of us said, "Oh my God!" Jerry came around, said, "Well, I have the death mask of James Joyce in my hands. What are you so excited about?" I bumped into the archive of the Cranach Press Hamlet printing. This is Edward Gordon Craig's important fine press printing of Hamlet. We found the drawers with the blocks. I found the drawers with the blocks. These are woodcuts that were used not only to print the Cranach Press Hamlet, but were used as models for what Edward Gordon Craig had been hired to do by the Moscow Arts Theater, which was to design the first modern presentation of Hamlet in Moscow Arts Theater production. For those of you who ever saw the movie Julia, she's traveling to go see the Moscow Arts production of Hamlet. Well, you've seen a few blocks and you wonder how in the hell am I even knowing what I'm looking at. Well, I just happened to be the Greenhorn librarian in 1984 that wrote a catalog in Edward Gordon Craig and the Theater of the Imagination. This is one of these moments where the right person in the right place at the right time opens the right box. That's very rare in rare books, but it happened. I then had to spend the rest of the day explaining to him why I was so excited. So this is a production of Hamlet that happened in 1911, 1912. It brought together 2 of the most important of 20th century theater practitioners, Stanislavski and Edward Gordon Craig. They collaborated to create a modern introduction to Hamlet. Craig's contribution was to design a set of modular components of vertical and horizontal lines that could simply be moved to create stage sets. And that, in fact, became one of the most important aspects of the production, these abstract scenes that moved and altered as time passed. We also found, however, all the portfolios for the printing production of the book itself and some draft pulls. Craig was interested in the production and also in the book in producing black on black on black. And you can imagine how the printers were feeling about this as he kept revising the printed sheets to give you layers of intensities of black. Craig was already an important figure in the 20th century. He had written The Art of Theater in 1905. In his process of designing the stage, he realized that he could use these same cuts, these model cuts, in actually printing the book, and hence the evolution of the Cranach Press Hamlet. And it's a powerful example of the book arts movement being in tandem with another artistic endeavor. There's a German translation of Shakespeare's play, first printed, surrounded by excerpts from the Saxo Grammaticus, and incorporating woodcuts by Edward Gordon Craig. Those of you and those of us who live in fine press printing, this is a stunning book on its own right. What I was playing with was the actual making material. This becomes the initial in German of their dog. So these images reference the staging of the Moscow Arts production, how these modules actually move around, both on the type face, on the type drawer, and what's the word I'm looking for, platform, and also on the stage at the same time. And these balsa figures are called the black figures of Edward Gordon Craig. And the most important image, the only time in which color is introduced, which is the moment of Ophelia entering the room. Jerry found the death mask in a ball canning jar box, wrapped in Dublin newspapers. Had arrived long before any of us had arrived. I have James Joyce's death mask in my hands. Keith Ellison made history in 2007 by becoming the first Muslim member of Congress. He represented the Minnesota 5th. And he punctuated the occasion by asking to be sworn in, or saying that he would be sworn in using a Quran. We're filming, right? I received an anonymous phone call, he said, the night before he called me, telling him that there was a Quran in Mr. Jefferson's collection and that they should simply call me and I would let them use the book. So I received a phone call and I said, certainly, I'd let you use Jefferson's Quran. This is how the Wikipedia entry, I have a Wikipedia entry about this, reads, Mark Dimunation, head of the Rare Book and Special Collections Division at the Library of Congress, Quran, and former resident of Congressional District Ellison, now represent number 5, Quran, said he was contacted early in December 2006 by Ellison, who told him he wanted to use a Quran that was special. As you had heard, I'm in the process of reconstructing Thomas Jefferson's library as it was acquired by the American people in 1814. It had been subjected to a fire in 1851 and 2/3 of the original Jefferson books were lost, and my project is to find exact matching copies of everything that had been destroyed. It's about 4,000 books that I was looking for. But Jefferson's Quran, and this is what the exhibition looks like, a wonderful glass circle of 6,487 volumes representing Jefferson's personal library, the largest of its kind in private hands at the time, and also really the moment in which the Enlightenment is fully delivered to America, as only someone who bought books both in Europe and America could accumulate over a period of 50 years. Jefferson's copy of the Quran, which he bought in 1764 or 65 from a newspaper shop because of paper tax, by and large. And this is the second edition of George Sale's English translation of the Quran direct from Arabic to English. We think that young Jefferson bought it. He bought it the same day that he bought several other law books. We think as a law student he was told that the Quran was Arabic law and that this is why it was in his collection. And now I had Mr. Ellison asking if he could in fact use it. It seemed to me only fitting, since this book had actually sat on the shelves in the Capitol from the opening of the new Capitol building until the fire in 1851, when books were removed again to protect them. This is the copy of Jefferson that he was requesting to use, and this is the much beloved manner in which Thomas Jefferson identifies his books. I'm sure you have numerous examples over here as well. Jefferson would look for the signature, which is the printed letter at the bottom of the lead leaf of a gathering in printing, and would put his corresponding initial to it. So he'd go to T and put a J in front of it. And here he would go to J, but in the 18th century, I and J were both represented by a single capital letter I. As I always say to people, there is no J Street in Washington, D.C. And so he would go to the letter I and put a T for Thomas Jefferson. Well, this seemed like a lovely idea for Representative Ellison to be bringing Thomas Jefferson back to the Capitol to celebrate the moment of Jefferson's library and to have a swearing in. Now, for those of you who don't know about the process, the actual official swearing in of any member of Congress takes place on the floor. They put their hands on nothing, they simply raise their hand, swear, and that's it. The images that you see with people putting their hands on Bibles are photo shoots for the family and friends. They're not official in any way. But one particular member of Congress, Virgil Goode, a Republican from Virginia, was outraged that there was any discussion of a Quran coming into the building. This is before the Jefferson connection was announced. And indicated that it was obvious that this was going to lead to many more Muslims being elected and invading Congress and bringing with them that book. This is a direct quote. It was only after the announcement that Ellison would be using Thomas Jefferson's copy that Virgil Goode suddenly disappeared from the conversation. Why? He represents the county in which Monticello is. little difficult to argue with that. So the experience was heady. I literally received death threats, as did several other people. And on the day of the event, we marched the Quran from the Library of Congress through the tunnels to the Capitol building. It wasn't intentional, but because we had several people following around a conservator, and I was carrying this in the box, somehow we ended up in this phalanx of a square box around me with me in the center, like I had a guard around me. And we marched through the Capitol, and only one photographer was allowed to follow, and it was all very kind of congressional in their behavior. It was a very busy day on the Hill. And we're going through the metal detector, and to my glee, one of the police officers, as the box goes through, says, "Is that the Quran?" I said, "Yes, it is. Would you like to see it?" And Dr. Billington's like, "Mark," and I said, "A police officer just asked to see the Quran. I'm showing it to him." And everybody came around, and I realized that this is one aspect of the nature of the book. It's a universalizing experience, and everyone can relate to it in a particular fashion. So here was a book that had been deemed to be very threatening in concept by a member of Congress that suddenly is drawn to people because it was a young president's book who had an understanding of, and it softened the moment in such a perfect way. We marched up to the elevator and got in. We had the Sergeant of Arms with us at this point. The door opened, and the House of Representatives had just been released. So there were literally hundreds of people in the hallway as we opened the door. And I swear, the first two people that walked by were Richard Gere and the Dalai Lama. I turned to somebody and said, "You saw that, right?" And he said, "Yes." I said, "Good." About the 70s, we're coming back. So I turned to the Sergeant at Arms. I said, "I'm not worried about the book, but how are we going to get to the room?" They had moved the representative to being the first person photographed because there was such an international interest in this event that there were hundreds of photographers on a stadium platform ready to shoot, and they wanted to get this cleared out. And I said, "Should we just walk out?" And when I tell the story, I always say, especially to librarians, every librarian should have this moment in their life. He walked out into the hallway and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, the Library of Congress has arrived! Please make way!" Zoom. And we marched down the middle of the aisle, thank you. And I handed the Quran to Dr. Billington, who stepped out into the spotlights so that Keith could be, Representative Ellison could be sworn in. And we heard 5 minutes of it was unbelievable. All from a casual phone call that I happened to be lucky enough to receive at my desk the day that it came. Some of you may have seen recently that this particular book was used in the most recent inauguration. This is in fact the Bible that was used by Abraham Lincoln on his first inaugural. The story behind it, and the reason I bring it up, is it's one of these books that has electricity about it. Each collection has its own version of these, but this is definitely one. Lincoln, who had won decisively, but nonetheless in a very bitter campaign, was literally smuggled into Washington, D.C., and he was not delivered to the White House, but instead to a remote place because there was such fear that he would be shot. So he arrived without his personal goods, and a member of the Supreme Court was asked to obtain for him a family Bible because his belongings were on a train from Springfield. It happened to be the Supreme Court justice that had voted in favor of the Dred Scott decision, so he was no great friend to Abraham Lincoln. The Dred Scott decision perpetuated slavery, but nonetheless bought this very kind of typical family Bible with a little red velvet cover, an Oxford printing from a few years previous. It says Holy Bible on the shield. And it was used by Abraham Lincoln. There's a lovely moment. We have a note from somebody, two people actually. One person said, in a very 19th century fashion. When His Excellency stood at the podium, the clouds parted and the sun hit the podium as Mr. Lincoln began his talk. It's a very 19th century kind of description. The other is, as His Excellency arrived at the podium, 100 sharpshooters arose throughout Washington. It was a very tense and nervous moment. When Barack Obama won his first election, his victory tour bus had on its side the angels of our better nature, which is a quote from the first inaugural address of Abraham Lincoln. And so, having worked for a couple of years at the Library of Congress, I was feeling gutsy, so I called the advance team, certainly didn't call President Obama, and said, I'm sure the president has his own family Bible, but I couldn't help but notice that he's quoting Lincoln, and I'm sure he would understand the symbolism of the first African-American president using Abraham Lincoln. And Barack Obama called the next day and said, yes, he would. And so this Bible that had been used by Abraham Lincoln became the Bible that was used by Barack Obama on his first swearing in. It had enough meaning for him that in the second inauguration, which happened to be held on Martin Luther King's birthday, he swore in with this Bible on top of Martin Luther King's private Bible, personal Bible. And so this book has an extraordinary amount of electricity when we bring it out. It just sort of breathes the moment. And many of our materials from the Lincoln collection have that. These are the contents of Abraham Lincoln's pockets from the night of his assassination, which are interesting mostly in their modesty. 2 pairs of glasses. The only money he's carrying is a Confederate $5 bill, a jackknife, a lens cleaner. But nonetheless, it's a moment that's captured through the remnants of this man. But this brings me to the book that has such great meaning for me. This is a really mundane and ordinary grammar, Kirkham's grammar, very popular in the early 19th century. Abraham Lincoln acquired this when he arrived in town newly as a lawyer because he wanted to work his way through a grammar so that he could improve his writing. And he indeed did buy it. Our copy becomes more interesting and more valuable because glued in the front page is a receipt from 1832, which makes this a very big deal. This is young Lincoln as a lawyer, and the receipt itself is for a certain amount of money, and it's for Mr. Rutledge to pay. So we have a receipt, a detail, a signature, a young signature, tucked into a book that was owned by Abraham Lincoln. Several women who lived along the way to the farm wrote to relatives outside of town saying, Mr. Lincoln seems to be making the walk frequently. This wasn't for legal reasons, it's because he literally met the farmer's daughter. And they were known to sit outside under a tree, the two of them, and read, which makes us then go back to the page, there's Lincoln's signature, back to the title page, where in Lincoln's hand, we assume in some sort of double entendre, it says, Anne Rutledge is now learning grammar. This is in fact the young woman that Abraham Lincoln fell in love with, and very tragically she dies a year after this event and throws him into the dark period that we all have come to know. So here's this ordinary object, a representation of Lincoln's attempt to improve himself, which becomes the conveyor of a moment of love and hopefulness that is dashed within a year. Between 1897 and 1911, Elizabeth Smith Miller and her daughter Anne Fitzhugh Miller filled 7 large scrapbooks with ephemera and memorabilia relating to their work with women's suffrage. They followed Susan B. Anthony on the road as she campaigned for the right for women to vote. These Miller scrapbooks are part of our National American Women's Suffrage Association collection. We are the documentation for the women's suffrage movement in America, in part because we also hold Susan B. Anthony's and also Elizabeth Cady Stanton's collections, both their book collections and their manuscript materials. What you're looking at here is an example of one of these scrapbooks, which is full of all sorts of pins and buttons and photographs, but also moments of great rarity. One of the few lifetime printings of a photograph of Harriet Tubman was found glued into one of these scrapbooks. There are amazing bits of documentation that are found along the way. But also we are exposed to the actual mementos of suffrage. And also to run into the life and role of Susan B. Anthony. Some of you might know that Anthony gave us her book collection in 1903, and some of you might be aware of the fact that she was arrested on Thanksgiving Day in 1872 for knowingly voting without having a lawful right to vote. She and three other women were arrested. They cited their rights under the 14th Amendment, and they were taken to trial. After her arrest on the courthouse steps, and this is where you kind of fall in love with Susan B. Anthony, she announced, "This government is not a democracy. It is not a republic. It is an odious aristocracy, a hateful oligarchy of sex which ordains all men sovereigns, all women subjects, and carries dissension, discord, and rebellion into every home in the nation." This is what she's saying to people as she's entering her trial. Well, the judge, our faithful judge, this is his first trial as a judge. And I think in order to be prepared, spent the night reading through the evidence, writing notes, and in fact wrote his decision. So when he came into the courtroom, he announced, "There's no reason to conduct a trial. The evidence stands for itself. You're found guilty." And then he imposed a very modest fine, I think as a gesture to Susan B. Anthony. And then he had the mistake of asking, "Does Miss Anthony have anything to say?" The book is 98 pages long. Her personal copy is signed over to us as "with thanks from the condemned." Elsewhere in the collection is this wonderful piece, The Women's Bible, done by Elizabeth Cady Stanton. I'll just tell you the quick story of it because I want to get through a couple stories. Like Jefferson, she clipped through the Bible, only in this case removed all misogynist references. It's a very short book. It was published and very popular, but it startled and scared the young women in the movement, and they excommunicated Elizabeth Cady Stanton from the suffrage movement. Maurice Hommaneau was a French legionnaire who, in a very famous battle in World War I, marched out with his troop and woke up 2 days later to discover he was the only member of his entire troop that had survived the battle. Although he had been injured, it turned out that his life was saved because he was carrying in his cape pocket a French translation of Kipling's Kim. See the bullet hole? And the book itself managed to stop the bullet that would have otherwise killed him. For this, he won the Croix de Guerre. When he heard that Kipling, Rudyard Kipling's son, John, was killed in the same battle, out of sympathy, he sent the book and the Croix de Guerre to Kipling. Kipling received the items first, and the next day received the letter. So his first letter to Hommaneau was, I received these objects, which a lot of people have been sending to me. You can imagine my great relief that somebody's alive that has sent them to me. I really can't take these from you. I need to send them back to you. And Hommaneau insisted as a gesture to Kipling's son, John. Kipling said, if you ever have a son, I will return these. Hommaneau indeed did, named him Jean in honor of Kipling. And Kipling packaged up the Croix de Guerre in that kind of Sandorski Sutcliffe binding that you saw it in, and put a package together and sent them back. Hommaneau had asked Kipling if he could send one word of advice to his young son, and he did. In fact, he says, when you were old enough to listen, as opposed to being listened to, your papa will tell you the story of a great, very great war in which a book of mine saved his life, for I am a writer of books. He's asked me to give you, I can recite the whole letter if I want. Later on, he says he's asked me to give one word of advice, and here it is. Always carry a book with you. The book should be between 350 and 400 pages. Don't use a hardcover book because they're harder to fit in your pocket. But first and foremost, it is of first importance. It should always be in your pocket, the left-hand breast pocket. those of us who buy books for collections have these moments every once in a while in which the book arrives, you close the door, and you have a good cry. I received another phone, I'm good with phone calls. I received a phone call in which I was told by a book dealer that I've known for 40 years, who, when I had arrived at the Library of Congress, asked me, "What are you missing?" He's a history of science book dealer. And I rattled off the books that I had been familiar with that I didn't have at LC, and also some books that anyone would love to have, one of which is what I said was simply the Galileo. He knew what I meant. And I received a phone call about 6 or 7 years ago now saying, "I think I have your Galileo." And indeed what he was calling about was that he had located a copy of the 1610 printing of Siderius Nuncius. This is the book in which Galileo announces to the world what the moon looks like when viewed through a telescope. This has a profound impact on Europe. It's a great story in the history of the book. It collapses time within only a matter of months, which used to take decades and generations in the manuscript period. And he was calling to tell me that he had a copy. It was a rough copy. He said it was a press copy. It never got bound, it never got trimmed, it never left the room. Fine, even better. For rare book geeks, that's even better. I mean, the book never went out into the horrible world. It just stayed very near its origin, the press. And here we have the title page from Siderius Nuncius. And as we began to look through it, it turns out my copy was uncut, never trimmed, which meant I had really the best example of this book as it came off the press. Here's the first image of the moon that Europe sees. 5 years after this is printed, a copy is logged in Beijing. So what would have been generations of manuscript copying is reduced to a trade route and a few years of travel. In other words, scientists can now talk to each other. Galileo is alive when Hevelius revises him, and it's a very important moment. Our copy, however, is flawed. It has a bit of a bump. It's why it stayed in the press. When I got to the second section of the book, I began to understand the value of our holding. This is the Starry Messenger. This is the Milky Way, but as you'll notice, the stars are very close to the edge of the paper, and when books are bound, they get trimmed. There are only 2 copies extant in which the entire Milky Way still exists. Mine is now one of them. And in the third, we are looking at Jupiter and what Galileo quite importantly calls the Medicean stars, the moons, but names them after his donors, the Medicis. And he's showing how they move around. He's making these observations, typesetting them, and then printing them. And when he's done, he pulls the page, which means we're pretty certain, you can have that moment. We're pretty certain this is Galileo's handprint. That takes us back to the front cover, where I can now tell you that what in fact we acquired was Galileo's copy of Starry Messenger. A colleague of mine at the time were preparing to make the case to the donors. We prepared PowerPoint slides. We had a 15-minute talk. We were going to slide into the importance of printing and history of astronomy and Galileo, and then this book. And we put the first slide up, and then the associate librarian, or the national librarian as they're called, Deanna Markham at the time, said, "Is someone offering us a Siderius Nuncius? We should buy it." One of my great moments. We are the home of Walt Whitman manuscripts and collections. We are actually lucky to be the home of 3 different Whitman collections in our Book and Special Collections division. Carolyn Wells Houghton and Charles Feinberg in particular found the publishing history of Whitman's masterwork to be completely compelling. Wells Houghton's collection, which was bequeathed to the Library of Congress in 1942, was renowned for its completeness and rarity. It included over 100 editions of the Grass. Feinberg was much more interested in a collection that emphasized the good gray poet's life and the world that surrounded him, as well as his work, and it's a very different kind of collection in temperament and feeling. And these brass dies, which are used to publish the very familiar first runs of editions of Whitman's spines, are in the collection as a result of him. Ultimately, Feinberg at the time had what was considered the finest collection of Whitman ever assembled, and it came to the Library of Congress in 1969. Walt Whitman and Henry David Thoreau met one autumn afternoon in Brooklyn. This moment, this historic intersection of American literature was captured in the simple exchange of books, mostly more than a century later, as only the serendipity of collecting and the vastness of the nation's library could evoke. These two literary lions met again at the Library of Congress. Although each had been fashioned a faithful student of nature, Whitman and Thoreau could not have been more unalike when they met each other for the first and only time in 1856. Whitman's personality could fill a room. His bold, broad, coarse presence signaled the verse of his newly published Leaves of Grass, which had come out in 1855. Thoreau was reticent and reclusive, well past the publication of his more contemplative A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers, and Walden, which was out in 54. When they finally met, each had already assessed the other's work with great respect, and yet face-to-face in Whitman's attic, surrounded by the Alcott minister mafia, glaring at them as they sat in Whitman's bedroom, the conversation between these two quintessential American writers simply stalled, until, that is, Whitman suggested that they go for a walk. The walk enlivened their meeting, and they eventually exchanged the gift of copies of their works. You're looking at Thoreau's copy of Leaves of Grass. It's hard to see, but in the top of the recto of the flyleaf, it says H.D. Thoreau from Walt Whitman and Denzel. So it's a presentation copy. Although each title would later emerge as one of their major writings, both of these authors were at a moment in which they were facing a financial failure with their new editions. Whitman presented his second edition of Leaves of Grass. This version is much thicker. It's the green squat version, not the sort of stately brown version. The spine is embossed with an olive green binding and emblazoned with Ralph Waldo Emerson's quote, which says, "I greet you at the beginning of a great career." Emerson is later quoted as saying, "I'm not sure if I read the book, but I know I never said that." Sounds familiar to us nowadays, doesn't it? In careful, restrained hand, Thoreau has penciled H.D. Thoreau from Walt Whitman. Thoreau, in turn, offered his first edition of the Concord and Merrimack. Whitman never passed up the opportunity to fill a page with his signature, and did so here. And in fact, when doing so, he realized that he had a whole empty flyleaf in front of him, and if he just turned the page, by gum, which indeed he did, and we got another signature. He later would pick up a pencil, and this is what he wrote. Thoreau called upon me in Brooklyn in 1856, and upon my giving him Leaves of Grass first edition, he actually needs second, gave me this volume. We had a 2 hours talk and walk. I liked him well. I think he told me he was busy at a surveying job down in Staten Island. He was full of animation, even in good health, looked very well, Walt Whitman. With their walk concluded, the two separated and went off into their lives, each with a volume tucked under their arms. Years later, those books would drift into the market, separated from the men and the moment they'd served to commemorate. It would take a century and a flash of kismet before the books would again reunite to memorialize their meeting in Brooklyn. And much in the same manner of the original exchange, two collectors each came forward with a book to offer, this time at the Library of Congress. For years, these books stood in two separate Whitman collections, facing each other in the rare book vault, literally facing each other in mute celebration of a meeting past in time, until their true association was discovered after I arrived. Walt Whitman and Henry David Thoreau met one autumn afternoon. Both of them would later reflect on the meaning of their visit, but none of their brief musings and recollections capture the poignancy of the story of two books that actually exchanged hands one day in Brooklyn. Thanks.
We got plenty of time.
Okay.
Anyone want to hear more stories?
Good save.
More questions?
More questions. Okay, good. Yeah, untouched practically. Yes, the Galileo, although we teach with it a lot because there's so much to be said about that book. But I wasn't kidding. The two of us locked ourselves in the Rosenwald room and had a good cry for about an hour. Big purchase. We also shopped it to every expert. I mean, especially in this period with Italian books, we had to bring it to anyone who knew anything about Starry Messenger. We had to paper test it, we had to buy it. We really had to be careful. We were stepping into the big fraud problem that was happening with Italian books at the time, especially Galileo's.
So who cut the pages?
No, I mean, they weren't trimmed. They were,
okay.
yeah.
So how did the book do?
It was in it, and that was very important, and we demanded more than 100-year provenance analysis. Dealers hate, because usually they could just give you who they bought it from, but we required proof that it was in the family in the 19th century before we would buy it. So it was in an Italian family's collection all those years. Yeah, we were really lucky. But it comes from, I mean, Jim, I'm sure can tell us, it comes from our relationships with dealers and the collegial nature of it. If you go in, at least from my training, if you go in treating it like a business, they'll treat you like a business. If you go in with them as colleagues and you have these kinds of relationships, there will be the moment. I mean, he could have sold this to any number of people, but I'm the one he called, and it has to do a lot with how we run our world, how we run our business with them, and where it sits best. And the number of people who've seen this Galileo far outstrips any other place that you could have placed it. So it's been reproduced. We had a conference about it. It's fully digitized. You can look at it online. It's quite a moment.
There's a Hevelius in the exhibit.
And to put those two, to put the Hevelius next to that rough image of the first moon, and then tell people it's only 30 years apart, really drives home what's happening in the world in terms of what printing is doing to the world. That in one person's lifetime, the moon can go from a rough woodcut piece of cheese to a fully mapped out universe of mountains and valleys and numbers and latitudes and longitudes. It's quite stunning. And telescopes, yes. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Sorry to be a little off the subject. I was wondering if the funding of the Library of Congress is adequate or if it's adequate, and what the future looks like for the Library of Congress.
Well, I have to say first and foremost, I'm an employee of Congress.
Sure.
Our allocation for the Library of Congress comes as a single figure from the budget. Of late, Congress has taken to telling us what to do with certain parts of that budget, which makes it difficult for us, more difficult for us. You may have also noticed that there was a copyright law that's being pushed through right now that has severe implications for us. So our budgets are based on a budget that's 9 years old at the moment. That's where they use as the standard. Yeah.
What were some of the other books you said you'd like to have, and have you gotten any of them?
Well, there's Harvey's Circulation of Blood, of course, which nobody ever has, and everyone would love to have. There was a small pamphlet, which I've since discovered we owned, but was the original Origin of Species article that appeared in a historical, some History of Science journal before the Darwin's book was published. There's a Copernicus printing that's very, very scarce that I would love to have. And then there were a couple of more in line of what the exhibit is about, flat books and body books. Like Joe's skeleton from the Renaissance kind of thing. Little pages, little bits of flat smooth sides so we can study, which are really important. I have enough books that spin and go, that bark in the night, so I wasn't looking so much for those. But there were certain high points in the history of science that, in particular, that I was really kind of desperate to have. I never imagined this would be the one that we would call out, so it's pretty possible. Yeah.
One of your stories was about finding the Joyce mask and a certain disorganization to the the collection, are there still things to be discovered? in
No,
the
well,
collection?
that's it, and I need to always be careful when I tell that story. The collection itself is not disorganized. It's just that this lovely man who everyone adored was suffering from a brain tumor, and so he felt he needed to make the books secure. So it wasn't disorganization, he just hid books without telling anybody, and so we didn't know where to find them. We knew we had them, but we didn't know what he had done with them. So the collection is intensely organized, but we were still looking for the book. The books are named after him. Just out of fairness to him, I won't name it, though we would always look for blank books. And by now we have found most of them. Occasionally we will bump more along the line of these two books facing each other until the coincidence of looking at them and saying, oh my God, these are the actual books they've exchanged. We have had moments, I had an experience at Cornell where someone came in to validate Wordsworth's signature, and it's not uncommon for literary manuscripts with a name maybe torn off of things because it may have been a lease, but it still says William Wordsworth. They sell the autograph. And as he handed it to me, he said, I just want you to authenticate the signature. I looked at it and I said, just a second. And I went to my Wordsworth collection and pulled out a piece of paper and went, and everyone would have sat there kind of like, and I said, well, you own a real Wordsworth signature. It's worth a lot of money. And he walked away. I asked if I could make a photocopy and a photograph of it, and he walked away, and about 10 minutes later came back and gave it to us. So there are these kinds of moments, or things that are tucked into books. What's this? Oh my God, kind of. So it's more that than stumbling across a lost collection. Yeah.
How far along are you in reconstituting Jefferson's collection?
Oh, we've made, although I like to say it's job security, so, don't want to finish too fast. I started in 1998. I had 4,000 books to acquire. I'm down to less than 240. So, and it very much mimicked Jefferson's experience at first. Books were coming in by box loads because we were kind of skimming, the cream, and then they got a little less frequent, and then I had to start going to specialty dealers, and I would be writing letters, and there's a very famous letter that Jefferson writes to some poor English book dealer where he says, send me only the edition of the book I asked for unless it's very expensive, in which case don't send it to me. And if another book is more expensive but not occasional, don't send it to me even though I've asked you to send it to me. And I'm writing this dealer saying I want this but not this. And so I was kind of channeling Jefferson maybe a little too intensely. But now they come in maybe about 2 books every 6 months. It's really getting thin, hard. There are a couple of sleepers in there, I think, and there's certainly one book in there with American Compass, which would be everybody in America going at it at the same time, so I won't get that one. Yeah.
The Rosenbach Museum here in Philadelphia supposedly has on a long-term loan one of the Joyce death masks. Is it yours?
No, we haven't.
Okay.
That was my photo of my mask. So I don't know, you might have one of the second runs, or they may, I don't know the story, but we were listed, there are 3 that are listed as having the original issue from which illegal copies were made. So you may have a second round, which might be why that's so easily put on loan. But I don't know for a fact. The tower might not be able to deal with the fact that I'm really cutting into your time. The tower might not be able to deal with the security of the mask and might be willing to give it up. Thank you. You've really been lovely. Do you want me to?
Yeah.
Okay.
Actually, we have until, am I reading this right? We have another 15 minutes. If anyone has more questions.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, I elongated your session.
I've known Alice for a while. Hi.
Have you done any forensic investigation regarding your suspicions that that's Galileo's handprint?
Well, it's hard to. There's a logistical proof which is if you were printing this sheet and if your hands were dirty, this is where you would pull that sheet of paper. And we know that Galileo printed that section of the Medicean stars. Recently, maybe 9 months ago, they found a jarred fetish of Galileo's thumb, which I guess we would have to reconstitute, but unfortunately we don't have a thumbprint, we have fingers. But I don't know if there's any other way. I mean, we have other things in our collections. You know, we have Jefferson's hair, so when we talk about Sally Hemings and Who's Who, that's relatively more easily done, but we don't have, I just have to say, we can only assume that these are, unless the crowd is below the age of 19, in which I just simply say, these are Galileo's fingerprints, right? Yeah. I was showing an example of the Federalist that was owned by Jefferson. Jefferson was in Paris when the Federalist, the essays in support of the Constitution, was published. And it's one of the few books, we bring it up because it's one of the few books that Jefferson writes in. We actually share a pamphlet, the two of us each have a pamphlet of the Some Review of English Americans, the Library Company and the Library of Congress, that have extensive annotations by Jefferson. They're two separate copies, each of them almost identical.
We actually have two.
You have two? So there are 3 extents, yeah. So we kept the best copy and let the other 2. It's really not a competition. I didn't realize you had 2. So the other 3, which is even better the story because it was Jefferson being unhappy with what happened to the pamphlet, and so he hand-corrected everyone he could get his hands on. But it's very rare to find anything that Jefferson has written in. So I'm showing this pamphlet to a class from a university nearby, but they were freshmen. And I said, it's interesting because this is where Jefferson plays the parlor game that everybody in the 18th century played, who wrote which essay, because every essay is signed Publius. And Jefferson has written, John Jay wrote 2, 3, 4, 5, and 64, Mr. Madison wrote 7, 8, 9, 10, blah, 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 and Mr. Hamilton wrote the rest. And I said, Jefferson never wanted to pay for a book if he could get one free, so it's always interesting to me that this most important political philosophical work of the 18th century is a third-hand copy owned by Mr. Jefferson, having received it from Mrs. Church. And one of the students went, Angelica Church? And I said, yes. As in Angelica Schuyler? Yes. I mean, like Elizabeth Schuyler's sister, then he went, Elizabeth Schuyler was married to Alexander Hamilton, and starts rattling off, and I'm thinking, oh my God, I see the musical. Which I have seen 3 times. And know it backwards and forwards, and so I'm laughing. And the faculty member is looking at him like, who in the hell are you? And he goes on, he turns to a classmate before I can say anything. Hamilton wrote most of the essays, and probably what happened is Elizabeth gave it to Angelica when Angelica was in Philadelphia, or in New York, and then she brought it back to London. She married Mr. Church, but moved to London, and she was a very good friend, and he's rattling this on, and the faculty member said, I'm really sorry, I don't know where he's getting this from. I said, you don't? I said, I do, and he said, what is it? And I went, Angelica, as a kid, he said, Eliza. Work. So it's so, you know, you never know what's going to draw a student. And this kid was beyond glory that this book was in front of him, because it had so much meaning to him, and the names themselves were the conduit to that whole story, which he held, given the virtue of that particular piece of musical theater, at a graduate student level of understanding of how that book was written. And the faculty member at the end said, I don't understand that. He never says anything in class. So he said, he's not a very good student. And I said, well, maybe you're teaching him the wrong way. So sometimes these books that we find, these little wow moments, we don't quite realize how they're going to hook and connect to others. I mean, I walk past 2 books that are in my collection yours are nice, these are nicer copies, but when you see them living with their friends in the case, you realize a whole new layer of meaning. And I hope you actually spend time going back to the exhibition, because there are levels of interaction with these materials. They're not just interesting books, it's how they relate to the other kids in the playground that becomes important too. We're going to stop there.
Thank you, Mark. Alice Austin. Alice Austin has worked as a book conservator at the library company since 1999. She's the young gal in the department. Her talk is based on her essay of the same title, which will be published by the Legacy Press in Volume 4 of Suave Mechanical. Don't we have a copy up there? Oh, no, it hasn't
We
been
have a
published
few
yet.
of the other copies.
We have the first 3 volumes of Suave.
Right, for people to look at.
Suave Mechanical's Essays on the History of Bookbinding. Alice is a printmaker and book artist and has made many tunnel books of her own design. Her artist books are widely held in museums, private, public, and special collections worldwide. And she's going to talk to us about the history of the tunnel book.
Yeah.
Alice Austin.
Thank you. Well, hello everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm excited that you're all here. I'm really excited this day is finally here. Thank you to Mark and Russell for coming. That really makes it extra special. I'd like to thank my co-colleagues, Andrea Kopp and Jennifer Rosner. Curating this exhibit was really a fantastic experience for us, and we really enjoyed working as a team. I'd also like to thank library company staff. There's so many people to mention. Everyone was incredibly helpful. Holly Phelps did great forensic work for me whenever I would find something buried in the stacks. She would unearth all kinds of good details that I needed. Erica Fiola and Sarah Weatherwax in the print department were just continuously cheerful with pulling yet another request for me. I think I need to see this, I would say excitedly, and they would pull it for me to look at. Gosh, there's so many people. Jim looked over our labels, and Connie did too, and gosh, Emma Riccardi, but mostly I have to thank Conchetta Barbera, who made the books really come alive with her great video. And your video is everything we wanted it to be, and it's just fantastic. Thank you so much. So, without further ado, I wrote this essay with my good friend Emily Martin. She was asked by the Legacy Press, Kathy Baker and Julia Miller to write something for the book, the next book. It's a collection of essays by all different authors, and we have a few up here at the front of the room if you're not familiar with the series. They're really a great resource for the history of bookbinding. So Emily and I were thrilled to take this on. It ended up taking, of course, much longer than we envisioned, and it required us to go back and forth to visit each other. She lives in Iowa City and teaches for the Center of the Book there, but really it was a great process, and we got to get our reader's card at the Library of Congress and do research there, and I saw wonderful books at the Morgan Library in New York. Winterthur Library in Delaware ended up having a fantastic collection. I looked up tunnel books, or peep show books in their catalog online and found one, so I excitedly went down to see it. And the librarian said, well, wouldn't you like to see any of the others? And I said, you have others? And she proceeded to bring out box after box of these books. And it's a treasure trove. So in our final chapter, there's quite a few from their collection that are highlighted. So without further ado, I'll delve into book theater, the history of the tunnel book. It is theater because it started that way. All right. Which way is?
The right side.
The other right side. Wait.
There are 4 gray pads.
Oh, that other side. Yeah, how do I turn off the this one? What's down here? So this is a schematic of a tunnel book. You basically look through a front opening, and it is like a little theater inside. And all of the panels are attached now, as we know them, with accordion sides. And the great thing about these magical books is that they are flat when you pick it up, but then you open it and it becomes a dimensional world that you can just get lost in. This interest in perspective started back, very early, probably the 1600s, optical boxes, the study of telescopes and microscopes and camera obscuras and entire rooms that people set up in their palaces with optical studies. People were fascinated. And this is Palazzo Spada in Rome, designed by Borromini, and it's a fake, it's an optical illusion. It's actually quite short, but he had the columns made progressively smaller, and the statue at the end is very tiny. It's only, when you walk back to it, it's tiny. It's like 2.5 feet tall. It's really a treat. This is also on the hilltop in Rome. It's a view through a keyhole in the Knights of Malta's doorway into their garden. And you don't see any of the garden. You look down this alleyway of shrubbery, and at the other end, your eye focuses on St. Peter's, the Dome of St. Peter's, which is actually at least a mile away from where you're standing on this hilltop in Rome. But it's just a wonderful, magical illusion. And it's funny because you get to this hilltop in Rome and you notice a little group of tourists like huddled around a little doorway, and you think, okay, well, that must be it. And you go over there, and it's a very plain door, but the surface, that keyhole area, has been polished to a shiny finish by everyone bending forward and looking at it. Oh my gosh. So there were a lot of steps in between that and this. This is Sergeant Bell and his Verri show. So people were transferring that thought of theater and gardens and distance. This is a traveling showman with a theater that he would take from spot to spot. That was the Rare show. The Brits called it Rarey. Maybe that was the result of a riddle that was sung. But he would go from place to place and charge a penny or whatever they charged, and you would see different events from different times, and it was really a way of spreading news, like what was happening in the world. And it wasn't just current events like the Lisbon earthquake of 1775, so 55, 65. But it was also biblical scenes, current events. You could see how the king was living. So the traveling showman could change out the scenes. So you would be exposed to all these different wonders. This is a wonderful little tunnel book. It's not really a tunnel book. So this is a little theater set, and the sides are not attached. This is in the collection at the Morgan Library in New York, and it's a bookbindery shop. So Engelbrecht was the first person to start making these as what I think of as tunnel books. He got royal permission from the king in around 1700 to make these, and since he had royal permission, he had the monopoly. So no one else was allowed to produce these and sell them. His monopoly lasted for almost 100 years. His son inherited it, so his firm continued to make these tunnel books, and they're just beautifully made. They're all engravings and hand-colored. And basically, only the rich could afford to buy these. So these you set up in your parlor and amused yourself and your friends with them. All of the scenes you set up in actually a wooden box that you bought for this purpose. So this is the bookbindery shop, which I love. We have the man outside the shop pounding the pages of the books, which is something Jeff Peachy spent a whole chapter discussing in one of the earlier Suave Mechanicals to show that that was actually why wrinkles were in books, older books that you look at, are all warped in a certain way. So they were pounded to flatten out, and on the right you see someone sewing on a book frame. On the left you see someone folding, and then in the middle someone's holding a sewing frame, I think. And in the back, this is going to tie into Russell's talk, I think, you see hanging up on the right sheets of paper, and underneath that someone is probably dipping those pieces of paper in size, liquid size, gelatin size, to make the paper stronger. And Tim Barrett has done a lot of research, which Russell will also talk about how quickly paper was made in that time period. And when was the paper size? Was it before printing? Was it after printing? So that's something you'll see. But so I was thrilled when I found this in the Morgan, and I only found it because Maria Fredericks pointed it out to me. She's the conservator there, and she, of course, loves this. So that was great. This is another Engelbrecht. It's a scene. It's called a fete. So it's some kind of water competition where people have to push themselves or push each other off their boats with these long poles. And in the back you see the king, I suppose, the royal court watching them. So that's the privilege from the king that's engraved. These don't contain any words except for that privilege. And then on the right you see Martin Engelbrecht made it. And then he had a very systematic way of labeling them, so you could make sure you had his different theater panels arranged in the correct way when you looked at them in your box. And there's a detail of all the action taking place. And there's a great scene in that one where it looks like one of the women is actually victorious. It would be interesting to know what that festival was all about, but that would be a whole other topic of research. And this is another Engelbrecht. This is in the Winterthur collection also, as with the last one. This is the Masons Lodge, the Freemasons Lodge. And it's the view into that secret world. So there's all the Freemasons, you can tell them by their distinctive aprons. And they're all gathered around in a place of learning, showing what they're measuring and looking at. And this is interesting because the owner at some point, and we don't know when this was added, but they made this very carefully done and hand-painted accordion sides so that they are all held together and you don't need the wooden box to look at them. This is by the next person who became very important in the history of the tunnel book, Friedrich Heinrich Müller. And he started about 1810, after Engelbrecht lost his monopoly. He was already a very popular printer of children's books and toys and prints, and he had a very popular shop in Vienna. So that says the wood in the sea. And so we're back to this format of having an actual stage set. So you would buy this and use it in your home and arrange your own stories and set up whichever views you wanted. So it was a set that came with all these interchangeable pieces. This you would set up in a wood board. That would be your peephole that you would look through into the world. This wood board that it came with, and I don't know whether this was original or someone had made it later, but that's how the front panel sets up, and then you just slot the other pages or panels into it, and you could play, like you're telling a story, the bulls could go romping by, or that's one bull. But they were all very carefully made and carefully hand-colored, so kids must have had a lot of fun with them. But then we get a little bit later in time, after the 1820s, and these items become mass-produced souvenirs that were obviously much more cheaply, because they're still really lovely and really fun to look at, but they were obviously made for a multiple country market, because the titles are now appearing in 3 different languages. So this is the walking tour of Hamburg. And they don't always necessarily actually depict the places that they are supposed to depict very carefully. Because I got all excited, looking in one about Rome. I thought, I love Rome, I'm gonna love this. And then you look inside, it doesn't look at all like Rome. It's just some generic hillside or something. So this was quite a marketing tool. But you can see the little girl on the left is looking into a peep show that she's holding on the desk. So by this time they had become more common in households, and they were no longer these expensive elitist items. And they really became souvenirs. So that center hole is supposed to symbolize an eye, a stylized eye with the eyelashes coming around it. So then we leap into the Thames Tunnel. There's a Thames Tunnel book, and this item of ephemera is on exhibit in the show, which showed, so this was, I was very excited to find this in our collection. It lists that you could go and see the tunnel, go in and see it happening, being built in, it started being dug in 1825. Brunel was the one who made the whole Thames Tunnel possible. He was the engineer who devised a metal shield, a cast iron metal shield, that they actually sunk into the river just by its own weight. They just set it there and let it sink. And then these poor miners had to go down and dig, and they dug in these cells, these tiny cells that were just big enough for a man to stand in, and they basically dug the whole Thames Tunnel under the river, like under the river. I never even understood that until I started to think about it more. One brick at a time. So they would dig out, each person would dig out enough space within their little cell to fit in one more brick, and then the whole frame would be pushed forward 4 inches by a crew that was behind them. This was such horrible work. The Thames was so polluted, and there was so much methane gas down there that the diggers would only last about 4 hours, and then they would pass out and have to be replaced by another crew. So. And this whole process went on for years, and at some point, of course, the construction failed, and the whole tunnel was flooded. Some people died. Brunel almost died. And that is actually shown in the tunnel book that's on display. If you look very carefully on the bottom of it and on the top of it, in the very first segment, you'll see that there's a half semi-ellipse that splits. When the tunnel book is closed, you see the inundation of the tunnel works, and then it gives you all the facts about what that meant. And then when the tunnel book opens, that goes to the top and the bottom of the tunnel book. It's really very ingenious. So take a close look when you go to see it. This is the case that the tunnel book that we own came in. So since the building of the tunnel took so long, and they kept going basically bankrupt because it was taking much too long, costing much too much, they took to selling these tickets. You could go down and see the tunnel being built, which was pretty bizarre. But they sold a lot of souvenirs. Oh, and that's when it's closed. You see the tunnel is being pictured collapsing there in the middle. And it tells you how many bags of clay they had to throw in there to stop it from collapsing. They actually had to stop digging for quite a few years until they could get enough money again and enough backers to say, all right, you can continue. And that's looking into it. And that's from the side. This is also a Thames Tunnel book that's at the Library of Congress, and it's interesting because it's 2 floors of tunnel. So when you look at the eye hole on the bottom, you see through the tunnel, and when you look at the eye hole on the top, you see on top of the river. It's so fun. It's just, I'd love to think of the people who designed these. It seems like they had a good time. I don't know if they did. People certainly enjoyed them. There were at least 40 different versions of the Thames Tunnel books that were made, that were sold. In the end, the tunnel ended up being a huge tourist attraction, the 8th wonder of the world. I think over 1 million people went in to see it in the first 3 months it was opened. It was supposed to originally be a major transportation route from one side of the river to the other, but they could never build the horse ramps that they needed to get carriages through. So it had ended up just being a thoroughfare for walkers and tourists, and a great big, well, it was a brothel apparently for a while too, but a big fair, a big never-ending bazaar. there were printers who set up their printing presses in there, and actually they were constructing these tunnel books. You could buy them in sheets if you wanted to and make them at home. That would be obviously the cheapest version. Or you could get one that was more expensive and more elaborate if you wanted to pay more money. You could buy prints, all kinds of paraphernalia, scarves, little magic eggs that you twirled scenes through, all kinds of great, wonderful things. This is a view just of the detail looking into that one from the Library of Congress. On the top you see, before you actually go to the river, the quay side. Quay? Quay. Yeah, and there you are, the boats on top of the river. So it's really very magical to hold these things that seem like toys, but they're much more sophisticated than that. They tell you so much about the time period in so many different ways. So I think they're a great resource for scholars for many reasons. This is one in the Winterthur collection that I just love. It's very sloppily put together. It makes me think someone just bought that cheap kit and did it at home, because none of the accordion sides match up. They're just a mess. And the hand coloring is very sloppy. But it shows Queen Victoria arriving to see the tunnel. And apparently she arrived just one day unannounced on her royal barge. But this one also has a variety of holes. And if you look in the top one, you see on top of the river. And the bottom two, you see into the tunnel. And there's 2 holes because there were 2 sides to the tunnel. And that's a view on the top. You can see it's just very quickly cut out, very clumsily colored. And it's interesting when you really start looking at these carefully, you'll notice the way they were constructed, and that tells you a lot about how much money it took to make them and how quickly they needed to sell them. The one that we have that's on display in the exhibit, if you take a careful look at it, you'll notice that all of the panels are exactly the same. So that would save you a lot in printing effort, right? You only have to make one plate. But all of the people are cut out and pasted on. So by moving those people around and coloring each panel in a slightly different way, you create the illusion that you have something that's actually a lot more sophisticated than it is. But it makes so much sense when I think about it in terms of what I do for my own books. I want to try to figure out how I don't drive myself totally insane. I don't want to make a totally different page every time if I don't need to. You want to figure out how to streamline, especially if you're doing editions. And these were huge editions. So this is looking into a little handmade tunnel book that we have that's on display in the exhibit. It's a wonderful, sweet little thing. And it's all just hand-drawn and hand-colored. And it's tempting to think that someone made this who had been to the Thames Tunnel and didn't have that extra penny or whatever to buy their own. So they made their own. And take a good look at it. It's in the show. I just love it. And Jennifer Rosner helped us date this because of the paper that was used to cover, the pattern paper that was used to cover the front and the back. That paper was made at a certain time period, around 1850, and the elements were locked up in a bed and then printed, and then decorated paper was made and sold, and it was used for a variety of reasons. It wasn't always used in books. That's the back. So you see they got a little bit more decorative. They had some green and some pink. And they didn't have a whole piece, so they pieced it together. And it's very dirty, very worn. There's some faint writing on the side of it with someone's name, but you can't really make it out. You think you make it out. So it's really a mystery. So this is Lane's telescopic view of the Great Exhibition in London. This took place in Hyde Park, and probably a lot of you know about the Great Exhibition. Paxton was the designer of the Crystal Palace, as it became known, because it was actually, Paxton was a gardener, and he designed greenhouses for the Duke of Derbyshire or something. And he had come up with this great new method of building greenhouses, and so nobody was coming up with a good plan to build this huge exhibition hall really quickly. And he came up with this crazy plan to build a huge greenhouse, and it was accepted in part because Brunel's son, Brunel Kingdom, or Kingdom Brunel, anyway, his son was the engineer for it, and they figured out how to build it out of cast iron pieces and put it together in a way that it only took 9 months to put this entire structure together. Also, There was no longer a tax on glass. There had been, up until that very point, an extremely prohibitive tax on glass. And so no one could afford much glass in their house. The more glass you had, of course, the more wealthy you were. But most people had very little glass and were very rarely in a place that had glass. Glass was hard to make. That was also another factor. At that point, the methods of making glass became much easier, so making plate glass wasn't so incredibly expensive. So the Crystal Palace was just a huge crowd draw, and there were, of course, a huge number of souvenirs sold. So this was a very popular item. And what's great about this one, this is at Winterthur, is that there's actually a plastic or a piece of lens right in that cover to give you the feeling that you're looking into a telescope. And the first fountain that you see in there is covered in glitter. So it's really fun. And it's interesting also that this is constructed with a very fine linen cloth accordion on the sides. And then each panel is tabbed on the back to that accordion. So it's really very carefully made. And to force the perspective view, the panel openings get smaller as they go back. And it's also interesting to me that the printer decided there was no point in printing that whole panel, because why waste all that ink? You know, that could get very expensive over the whole huge run. So they didn't waste. It's only printed where you're going to see it when you look in that front hole. This is La Fête de Barime in Constantinople. Very exotic. This one is great. At this point, the tunnel books, these souvenirs, had become a whole package. So that front is actually the front panel, the front of the box, and the back panel is the back of the box. So they're a whole unit. They open and close, and they're very neat. You don't have to have separate containers. It was really a very smart move on their part. And this one's quite complex. It's all very worn on the front, but it has 5 holes. And on the sides, you actually see into all the buildings that line the street. So this is a festival, an important festival, I forget which one. But you look into that center hole and you see this very delicately cut, really beautiful acrobatic man doing his show on top of the crowd from one window from a building. And you see the whole crowd out on the street. And then through those side windows, you do see into the buildings, and you see people in the buildings. You see 2 floors of the buildings because there's 2 holes on either side. It's really great. Go see it. Go to Winterthur. The librarians are great. And this is in the Library of Congress. It's called the Place de Vendôme, which turns out to be a very famous plot. I haven't been to Paris in a long time, but Jackie Colburn, the great librarian there, showed this to me, and it was one of her favorites, especially because she was so excited to tell me she didn't know what the title of this was because it doesn't have any text with it. But she went to Paris with her mother and she was looking for this spot. And she said, I found this spot in Paris, and I was so excited when I stood on that corner of that plaza or that spot and said, this is it, this is the tunnel book scene. The center hole is quite clumsily cut. I don't know why, but the 2 side holes, I mean, I like to think maybe the owner didn't think it was quite large enough, so they just made it bigger. The 2 side holes are very interesting because they had plugs built into them, so you wouldn't see, they're actually cloth buttons. You can see that one on the right is still blocking the hole. So when it's closed, you can't see in, it's a real secret. And you don't see it until you open it and it stretches out. And there you see that little button down the left, just flattens out to the bottom. But you also see down different avenues. Here's where that side view ends. The side view usually ends by about the 4th or 5th panel. It doesn't continue all the way to the back, I think, just because your eye can't continue to focus. The one that's the Fête de Barime is the longest one I looked at. It extends to 2 feet. So it's really quite amazing. You do have to have someone hold the other side of it, or you literally have to just set it on the floor and then stand on a chair and look down into it. They're really fun because it requires physical effort to look at them. Oops. Well, that seems to be where I ended today. Yeah, so That is about all I have for the history of tunnel books. So of course, what I found to be totally fascinating about this research was that I really didn't realize that the tunnel book had such a long, complex history. It really did not just suddenly arrive in the 20th century. There really is a long path for it, and it's just great. And of course, current artists love to use them. The interesting thing is that in this country, they are called tunnel books. That's become a genre term at the Library of Congress as of, I think, 2014. I have the exact date, Jackie gave it to me, which is good because that helps you find these things. So when you go to collections, and these are always mystery items, you know, I don't blame the librarians at all. It's like, how do you catalog these odd things so that people can find them? And it's nice to have a very specified term so that you know if it's this series of panels attached with accordions on the side, you could call it a tunnel book. They're also referred to as peep shows, more commonly in Britain and less often here, I think, because book artists certainly don't want to use that term because, of course, it has pornographic connotations. So you don't want to see my peep show? But because there's so many wonderful librarians out there, they helped us find all of the good treasures in their collections. And so if you go out looking for them in other collections, just persevere. Look under movable toys, look under peep shows, look under tunnel books, you know, try a whole variety of search terms. And the other great thing that I wanted to read to you, so I can find it, is the list of all the great different names. These changed names over time depending on who was making them and what country you were in. The French like to call them optiques. The Brits, actually, we found documented, didn't really start calling them peep shows until around 1900. They were called teleoramas. Tele means, I think, distance. Anyway, lots of different great names that people basically made up as they delved into making their own versions of the tunnel books and marketing, looking for a way to market, of course. So, thank you.
We're comfortably ahead of schedule, so we need time for questions.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, Russell.
So, Alex, between the popularity of these books in the Victorian era and their sort of resurgence in the contemporary book arts, were these being made in the sort of mid-20th century or as part of any art movements between the sort of tourism trade of the Victorian era and the book arts?
That's a great question. There seem to be very few that were made in the U.S. There's one for the New York Fair, the World's Fair, that Winter has also. And no, I don't know what happened.
Right. It would seem that the surrealists would have loved it.
There are handmade versions, like unique copies
Right.
that people made, artists made, certainly.
There's sort of a divergence at some point. Because I remember as a child, I had a theater, like a printed theater, that had little ballerinas on little, you know, the equivalent of a ruler, and you could
Oh,
stick
right.
it in and out. So that sort of earlier tradition of something in a box that you move the pieces around and told stories with, either died out and came back or continued sort of alongside, while the tunnel book seems to have developed into a very specific, you know, accordion-sided, more souvenir type thing.
Right.
Do you know anything about how the two went along side by side?
I don't.
Okay.
I mean, that's the thing about doing research. The more you research and the more you find, the more questions you have.
Right.
And I think easily someone could write a whole book about this. There are some very good books out there that were really helpful. But it's a fascinating topic, and I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, because I think I feel like I saw a children's catalog recently. They're still making that kind of thing.
That's neat. You can buy, I mean, some tunnel books are sold. There's a great Edward Gorey tunnel book that I bought recently. It had been originally released, I think, in the 80s, and then it was re-released recently. So you can get it from Amazon, I think, for $20. And it's great. And he was obviously influenced by the Thames Tunnel books because it's, of course, a very long, creepy tunnel with monsters, you know. It's called the Great Tunnel Calamity, you know, so it's just waiting to reach out and stab you with a knife. Yes?
Are these meant to be viewed in a static fashion, or do any of them, meant with the accordion size specifically to go in and out to give a sense of movement and changing perspective?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm glad you brought that up. And yes, they were meant to move. They weren't really meant to be static. Some of the scenes do seem kind of static, like when you look at the hillside in Hamburg. It's pretty static. But definitely the river scenes, it's great when it jiggles a little and the boats bounce up and down on the river. There was a German one, I think, in the collection of Winterthur, or it might have been Morgan, which commemorated the opening of the first railroad, and it was called Nuremberg am Fort, and you see that all the way down the railroad line, you know, and this was such a huge event, and the train bounces. It's really great. It becomes very animated. Yes?
Oh, I just lost his name. The man who makes pull tag books. Oh.
Megendorfer?
Megendorfer did a couple of tunnel books that could be configured in many different shapes. You could run it as a long stretch, or you could take the beginning and the end and make a circle.
Right.
And the famous one is in Stadtpark.
Right.
And your perspective of what's going on, and actually the stories that are told, change depending on how you configure it. You can configure it in 6 or 7 different ways.
That's really wonderful, and I really enjoyed seeing that at the Library of Congress. And I was able to find a copy, you know, a recently released also, but an exact copy somehow. I guess they just take pictures and produce it. It's really fun to play with because, of course, I wasn't allowed to rearrange the one at the Library of Congress. They set it out for me on the table, and I said, "This is great, can I rearrange it?" Because it has a picture of a boy rearranging it in all the different ways, so you can tell different stories and look at it from different angles. It's double-sided printing on each panel. It's really wonderful. Of course, I said no. You should. They said this is actually quite rare and valuable. Why don't you look on Amazon and see if you can find, you know, a recently reproduced? And I was able to find one. So I should have brought that today. I forgot about it. Mary,
What about the connection with the star tunnel or carousel?
that's a very good question. So there's usually a lot of confusion with what is exactly a tunnel book. What's a star carousel book? What's a carousel book is basically a carousel. So it opens, it's flat, you open it, it comes round, and it's a series of scenes, each one with nestled panels that fold in the middle. And so each scene, in a way, gives you the idea of being a tunnel book. But it is not a tunnel book. And apparently the carousel book was originated in Italy, I think in 1939, as a children's book format. So it's actually quite new. Anyone else? I left out lots of good information. Yes, Erica?
I'm just curious, during your research, I just thought of this, were you measuring the tunnel? Did you have like the longest, I guess what I'm asking,
Yes.
like, what was the longest one? that you
Yes.
found? How many scenes or about?
Right, that's a very good question. The longest, I was measuring them, and the longest one was the Fête de Bourrine, which was about 2 feet, or it was long, very long. Anyone else? Yes?
I'm thinking of all the probable conservation issues that you have with it, preservation. How are they stored, and do you have to look at different layers?
Right. That's a very good question. So they're stored flat, and depending on where you are, the conservation department may have made a special box to house it, and if you're really lucky, they've made a special stand so that when you as the librarian have to take it out to show to someone, you can set it up safely so that it can actually be viewed, because obviously many of them are pretty fragile. Some of them aren't, but many of them are, so you don't really want to hand it over to someone and say, go ahead. So it depends on where you work, but it is something you have to be really aware of. Anyone else?
Oh, when's your article going to be published and coming out? I saw mechanicals.
Oh, it will be out, I think, by September. Yeah, and we do have a few of the volumes of Swap Mechanicals, as I said earlier, here. They're up at the front in a stack. If you're not familiar with the series, you might want to take a quick look. There's some wide-ranging articles for topics. That's something that I love so much about this book, is that there's really something for everyone in every single volume, and it's a great resource value. And make sure you look at those tunnel books out there. Conchetta also included one, the little handmade one, in the video. So you'll see it opening and then being set up, and then you zoom in to the inside. It's really a great shot of that little gem. Thank you.
So we'll reconvene in about 45 minutes for the last talks. We have a nice long coffee break, but also I should say an exhibition viewing break, because I know you go to conferences like this, symposia like this, and you don't actually have any quality time in the exhibition. So all I can say is that the coffee's that way, the exhibition's that way, and we're not going to let you bring your coffee and cookies into the exhibition. So I think there must be a table outside there where you can leave them. Enjoy.
And if anyone's coming up to look at things, these are facsimiles of the book that I'll be talking about.
One back there behind the city, and there's one just to the left. It's on, you'll be on the right.
That is one of my favorite pieces, and I give another talk, which is sort of modern American voyages, and it's which shows very quality.
Yeah.
Yes, Joan.
See, it's in that little tiny box.
What's it doing? There's no other work on it?
There probably is, but that's, it, you can stream in HD.
Oh, that's good.
It's just faster.
I think she,
Talk to them, I agree.
Yeah, I think I have
Why?
Hopefully using a lot of time.
Yeah. Hopefully, actually, Rich got
I think so, yeah.
We just haven't had a whole lot of use for it until.
Well, it's been getting a lot of use
Yeah,
recently.
now it's been great. Yeah. Well, YouTube Live helped us a lot. Used to, when it first came out, you really could only stream through YouTube, and you had to pay for your subscription, and then all these ads. So we did
YouTube
it once.
doesn't have ads?
No. Because with that, that's so that's like so that's why we didn't able to use it. Before that, it was just kind of like you'd have a commercial come in the middle of the time. Right. So it was use it once for the
like pay the money for the subscription, like or something. He's like, no. Yes, we're actually live streaming it and recording it. That's a really great Instagram as well. I feel like oh, okay. There's one of our social media. Thank you.
You've seen his portrait more times than me.
Yeah. He recently on Facebook.
Oh, good. Oh, good.
Picture website.
We haven't actually seen it, so.
Oh, with the words. Yeah, right.
He's a printmaker as well.
The questions are 80. I got a really library Congress.
I did give Jim a mic.
With that Dean Dash book. I love it. I saw it for a couple of days. Now it looks nice to me when I look back at the pictures.
Yeah, it's not well crafted.
Ron represented him at the Bill and Maxwell Gallery.
Talking to somebody, something in
Really? Wow.
a video. Reminded me
Yeah, I haven't seen the work, even though it's all that. And there's
Rose reel, where, you know, you turn it and it's still there.
Looking at it tomorrow. Newspaper days. When I was living in Central Massachusetts.
That's going to be my question. You're home for 50 now. It speaks very much to the process that you take so far. I wonder if that's strong.
I have this friend.
Jennifer and Andrea about their experience on this exhibition, and we'll have a chance to ask them questions as well as a chance to ask our speaker, Russell Maret, questions, and that's pretty much the lineup for the rest of the day. So, I always get the wrong side up. Russell Maret was a type designer and a private press printer working in New York City. In 1996, Russell began teaching himself to design typefaces, leading to a 12-year study of typeforms before he completed his first typeface in 2008. This is actually kind of an amazing story. In 2011, he began working to convert some of his type designs into new metal typefaces. Since then, he has produced 3 metal typefaces and 4 suites of metal ornaments. In 2009, Russell was awarded the Rome Prize in Design from the American Academy in Rome. And Russell is going to talk to us about, I keep misreading this as Unitarian Bookmaking. That's another talk. Hungry Bibliophiles, an experiment in utilitarian bookmaking. Russell?
Yeah, it's a kind of strange idea thinking about utilitarian bookmaking as being unusual because books are meant to be used, right? But generally not the kind of books that I make, unfortunately. So anyway, it's really great to be here. It's very, you've made it when your warm-up routine is marking it. Thank you. You did a great job. Anyway, so I'm going to be speaking about a collaborative book project that I made over the last few years called Hungry Bibliophiles. But the story really begins in 2011 when I ordered 3,000 sheets of custom watermarked handmade paper from the Velká Lázní mill in the Czech Republic for my book Specimens of Diverse Characters. There they are. Sorry, the type is tiny. I don't know who designed that. But prior to dealing with the mill, it had never been realistic for me to even consider ordering so much handmade paper. And when it arrived in my shop, I was ecstatic. 3,000 sheets of handmade paper. My whole universe changed. So long mold-made paper, nothing that I ever made was going to be printed on anything but fine, custom handmade paper. And so when I got it in my shop, I started sorting and prepping it for printing. But as I began proofing on my beautiful new paper, the thrill I felt was quickly infused with anxiety. The type, rules, and tonal areas I was printing looked much heavier and slurrier than they were meant to look. There's always a bit of color gain when printing on handmade as opposed to mold-made paper, but this was different. There it is. Large solid areas were printing fine, but sharp lines were thick, and halftones and parallel lines were closing in on one another. Everything was just 2 stops too dark. It was as if the paper was not absorbing the ink. So, well, that's easy. Obviously, I would need to dampen the paper prior to printing. So I set a stack to dampen the night before what I hoped would be my first day of editioning. What I found the next morning threw me into an instant panic. Rather than being humidified and receptive, the paper looked like corrugated tin. Water had absorbed into sheets at dramatically different rates. The paper had stretched nearly 3/8 of an inch across its width, and as soon as it came into contact with air, it began to shrink in wildly unpredictable ways. Which is not a good thing. The printing in specimens involves such tight registration that I knew I would need to print dry in order to get my registration. But if the paper hasn't been dampened, I couldn't get the printing quality that I wanted. And to just give you an idea of the printing quality, so the registration in specimens is calibrated within 1/4 of a point. So a point is a 72nd of an inch. And so if you divide that in 4, that's what we're dealing with. And so this is a helpful chart. That's 3/8 of an inch. That's a 1/4 point line. That's 3/8 of an inch, and that's a 1/4 point line. So you can imagine the printing was going to be impossible. So, it's not really
each sheet and loft dry it before printing. Problem solved. Every new project has some hiccups. Why should this one be different? I read this to my wife last night and she laughed hysterically at that. I adjusted my schedule and printing was soon underway. Until one day, while redampening and etching to flatten the print, I noticed that the surface of the Velka lozenge became much more receptive to fine lines after a second soaking. The comedy that ensued over the following months can only be considered a comedy from the distance of many years, but it eventually involved 500 hours of work, soaking and drying each sheet not once, but twice to remove enough gelatin sizing from the surface of the paper so that it would print the way I wanted it to print. To give you an idea of what that was like in real time, here I am in my studio building lightweight drying racks. Here's my assistant Nancy Lober stringing them with twine so that they had to be light enough because we didn't have enough room in the studio to work and have paper drying, so we had to be able to lift the racks. Here's Sarah McDermott and Nancy loft drying the paper, and this is what my shop looked like while I printed this book. It was also about 95 degrees. So while visiting Iowa City the following year, I discussed these issues with the papermaker Tim Barrett, beginning a conversation that is still going on today. The central issue we've been discussing is this. Sizing has a negative impact on paper quality, but a beneficial impact on printing quality, but a beneficial impact on the endurance and aesthetics of handmade paper. Tim's research into pre-industrial European papermaking processes has suggested that some, if not most, post-15th century books were printed on water leaf or unsized paper, to which the book's printers or someone else added sizing after the fact. For those of us who use expensive handmade paper to make even more expensive books, the thought of dipping our printed sheets into a vat of liquid gelatin is fraught with morbid possibilities. Despite this, after our initial conversation, I sent Tim some printed sheets from specimens so that he could resize them. The results were intriguing, but not entirely persuasive. Although the increased durability of sized paper is appealing, the books that I make are not used in the ways that, say, a 16th century book was used. A contemporary press book that's printed on soft, unsized cotton paper, housed in a box and stored in a temperature-controlled library, will bear its age well. But if the same paper was used to print pocketbooks for traveling humanists, the books would not have withstood the demands of their owners. The repeated physical use to which many early books were subjected lent them a patina similar to well-used tools, full of shine and scuff. In addition to the frequency of opening or the method of storing their books, early modern bibliophiles differentiated themselves in one important way from their 21st century avatars. They wrote in their books. They wrote in the margins, between the lines, in the voids of woodcuts, on fly leaves and paste downs. We saw those books, the Walt Whitman and Henry David Thoreau. Walt Whitman would write on any part of the book. So people parsed, debated, excised, and amended their texts in ways that are unthinkable to contemporary press printers, but that were certainly expected by the printers of their day. If the paper in their books had not been sized, the ink in their pens would have bled into the paper fibers rather than holding a crisp line. On that flyleaf where Walt Whitman signed it, you could see that there was a gap in the sizing or something, and the ink just bled all over the place. So the expectation of marginalia was another determining factor in the sizing of book paper after printing. Just as it is today, use was the arbiter of process. But for those of you who might not know, sizing is a gelatin coating applied to paper. It seals the paper so that you can make notations in the margins without the ink bleeding into the paper fibers. It also increases the durability of paper for binding and handling. For instance, the paper that Tim Barrett made for Hungry Bibliophiles, before sizing it, it would break after 300 folds. After sizing, it took over 1,500 folds to break, which is it's just bulletproof, basically. You put this in your pocket. And to give you an idea of a contemporary popular printing paper, Mohawk Superfine breaks after 30 folds. So these are fold tests that have a kilogram of weight attached to them as stress. But anyway, originally sizing would have been made by boiling animal bones and scraps. It was a really nasty business. But today, paper makers typically use pre-processed photo-grade gelatin like this vat of goo here. And to give you an idea, we already saw it in the Walt Whitman, but here's a water-damaged title page of a book printed by Arrighi in 1525. And you can see the area where the sizing has been soaked off because of the ink of the idiots who wrote on it has bled into the paper fibers. I mean, the fact that they were idiots and they did write on it meant that and it was water damaged and disbound meant that I could own it, but you know, I'd still prefer. Well, I don't know what I prefer. Anyway, the reduction in the absorbency of sized paper, however, works against the printer, whose print quality depends on the ink being absorbed into the paper. And this is where, you know, just for understanding, it's important to say that ink means many different things. Ink for pens is liquid, it's like water or wine, whereas printing ink is extremely viscous, and I like to think of it as a really greasy cream cheese. And so if you're printing and with this stuff and it's oily and it's there on your type and you hit it in, you want it to go into the paper and be absorbed just enough to hold this crisp line. When it hits a barrier of sizing, it hits and just sort of goes, you know, and no one wants that. So with many of these issues in mind, Tim Barrett and his students at the University of Iowa Center for the Book have been trying to recreate the working conditions of a pre-industrial paper mill, employing a 3-person team to make 100 to 200 sheets of handmade paper an hour. That's opposed to 100 to 200 sheets per day, which would be a normal sort of paper-making output in the post-industrial paper-making world. The paper they are making is not meant to be perfect or precious, but well-made and serviceable, to invite contact and annotation. And with this paper, Tim and his colleagues are attempting an intriguing sleight of hand, engaging in historical process in the hope that it will arbitrate contemporary use. He's trying to make cheap, fast paper because he wants people to annotate it and mess with it. But he's Tim Barrett, and it's his paper. And for those of you who don't know who Tim Barrett is, he's the greatest living paper maker. No one wants to write or mess up his paper, you know. And so that's the problem, is that once a craftsperson puts something out into the world, he or she cannot control how that object is used. It's all well and good to want people to use paper in a certain way. It's another matter altogether to get them to actually do it. Handmade paper, however quickly made, instills a certain amount of fear in bibliophiles, and the speed with which it is made does not alter a paper's perceived preciousness. So in thinking about how to get people to use Tim's paper more aggressively, it occurred to me that I would have to make a book whose content would tilt the scales, a book whose text would encourage people to remove it from their shelf and bring it into the messy world of their daily lives. And no book satisfied this requirement better than a cookbook. In the hope of finding people who would be willing to put a fine book through the paces, I invited a group of printers, binders, and librarians to submit 1 or 2 recipes each for a small cookbook called Hungry Bibliophiles. In turn, each participant agreed to cook as many of the recipes as they could within the space of a year, turned out to be 2 years, to cook them with the book open on their countertops and to take notes in ink on the pages. The book would be printed on waterleaf paper that would be gelatin-sized after printing and bound in a historically inspired paper binding designed by Maria Fredericks. And these are just some of the there's Tim with his copy. Everybody was so excited with the idea that they could try to mess this book up. So people really took to taking pictures with things on them. There's Emily Martin. That made the cover of the facsimile. That's Emily Martin's book. That's Paul Gale and Rob Carlson's. And then this is a dinner party. A lot of, it's a really fun project because so many of us work in isolation from one another. We only see each other at book fairs or conferences and things. But the project created a lot of sort of Hungry Bibliophiles dinner parties. And so we'd all bring our books. And this, for instance, one of the recipes, David Usselman's venison curry, was so complicated that Paul and Rob made it and brought 4 participants in the project together to eat it there and take notes in the books, so we didn't all have to make it. And then my wife Annie made the hats for everybody. So every aspect of Hungry Bibliophiles was conceived in the spirit of Tim's work in the paper mill, primarily his experiments with speed. Tim, Maria, and I each respond viscerally to the imperfections that are the byproducts of pre-industrial speed, meaning those of a practiced hand working quickly rather than a machine working efficiently. And Hungry Bibliophiles gave us a chance to explore them in practice. Following Tim's lead, I designed a revival of a 17th century Dutch typeface for the text in 2 days. It was 16 hours of work for 163 characters. I allowed myself 1 drawing and 1 revision per letter form, aligned the letters by eye, and set each on a fixed width, just like metal type is fixed, in the hope of tapping into the spirited irregularity of the original. I then printed the book in 12 days, at the end of each week, shipped the finished sheets to Tim to size. I printed it on unsized paper. And then I drove the final batch of pages out to Iowa City so that I could participate in the sizing process. So here are the pre-sized sheets ready. And as you can imagine, the sizing process, or maybe you wouldn't, but the sizing process as Tim Barrett does it is fairly complex. First, the gelatin is dissolved in water and strained into a warm vat, in front of which you have to stand and lean over and dip your hands into. The sheets are separated and dredged 10 at a time through the liquid gelatin. There you see it. Imagine what your hand feels like. There's a historical document that says the sizers in paper mills would actually work naked in the vats. And so, I mean, just doing this, I've got a bit of hair on my hands, and they were all stuck together after just this. Imagine. Anyway, so after you dredge them through, the gelatin-soaked sheets are removed from the vat and stacked under a warm gelatin-infused felt to keep the gelatin from drying. Because of course, you're doing this 10 at a time, you've got a lot of sheets to do, and the fear is that the gelatin's going to set and all the sheets are going to stick together. And so you sort of keep them warm and liquidy as you're going. The sheets are then pressed in a screw press to remove excess liquid. And then while the gelatin is still wet, the sheets are individually separated and gently fluttered in the air, and that sets the gelatin. And then you no longer have to worry about them sticking together. The sheets are then hung to dry, and when they dry, they feel like potato chips.
Yeah.
They curl, the gelatin becomes hard, and you really stand sort of dumbstruck, like, how am I going to use these? And the way you deal with it is you then humidify them in a closed space. Okay, easy, right? So after a couple of more pressings and restackings over a couple of more days, the paper is ready for binding. So in keeping with the speed experiment, okay, wait, where'd she go?
Oh.
The little audiovisual, Annie did a time-lapse film of the binding, which we'll watch while I describe it. It takes a little while, but so in keeping with the speed experiment, Maria Fredericks, who we heard mentioned before, the conservator at the Morgan Library, set a goal of binding all 75 books in the edition in 2 days. To accomplish this, we assembled a crew of 8 variously experienced binders and set aside a weekend for our experiment. The crew consisted of Maria Fredericks, Ann Hillam, Vasari Rastanis, Yukari Hayashida, Annie Schlechter, Nancy Lober, Gaylord Chenelec, and me. Maria designed a long-stitch paper binding structure made entirely from University of Iowa papers and led the production. Annie made sandwiches to fuel the workers, and by Sunday afternoon, the 8 of us had bound 79 copies of the book. The books were then distributed to the participants to spend the next 2 years cooking, and we have since received the used books back, had them photographed by 42 Line in California, and produced a facsimile edition made from the annotated pages, which I'm going to run through as soon as this fascinating movie finishes. It really was fun. There we go. Yay. So part of the fun of this project is there are so many people involved. Well, one of the downsides of this project was the minute I finished it, I was confronted by the great number of people that I did not invite. And some of whom actually approached me and said, "Why didn't you invite me?" But the other side of it is that there are 25 people involved, and we all have, similar interests but different personalities, and so you get to see through the annotated pages that, some people loved sticking things in their book. Some people, this is one of 2 pages by Richard Siebert, who's quite a great cook himself. He refused to cook any of the recipes in the book, but instead wrote recipes in the book and wrote his theory on food throughout it. Some people just made these little marks. And the recipes went from extremely simple. This is Gaylord Chenelec's instant oatmeal recipe. But the first line of the instant oatmeal recipe is plant a variety of bitter cherry tree in an area frequented by white-tailed deer. And the people, this is Sarah Sowers and Mike Lewis Beck's page, they actually made it with cherries from a tree they planted. And then that's a great barbecue sauce recipe. Tim Barrett's spread. And then some of them got, some printers wrote what they were working on when they were, what printing projects they were working on. Carolee Campbell wrote what book she was printing while she was cooking. Some people got quite drunk. A lot of Negroni recipes. It's me. That's Annie's drawing. This is Paul Gale and Rob Carlson invited ringers over to have dinner, and so this is a whole bunch of fairly well-known graphic novelists came to dinner and did portraits. One night they invited 6 just incredible calligraphers to dinner, thinking they would get this amazing page, and all the calligraphers just straight away got drunk, and they wrote like limericks in the, it was terrible. That's venison blood for the venison curry. Walter Baczynski just did these beautiful paintings on every spread. And then Maria Frederick, so that each book came with an unsized sheet stuck in the back. And so Maria Fredericks did a sampling of all these different media on the sized and unsized, and made this beautiful thing. So, but anyway, so as an artist, I've always been skeptical of utility being applied as a quantifiable gauge of authenticity. I don't like the idea that so many people ask people who make books, why don't you make more? Why don't you want to spread your content into a greater audience? And I just hate that. The intensity of work that we do, we do as much as we can, and that's the, broad publishing is for other people. But as a lover of books, I'm confounded by the overly precious handling of artist books. Part of the problem is, of course, that many fine press and artist books are made with materials that inspire a justifiable fear in handling. Making and handling a book as art involves an entirely different set of priorities than making and handling a book as textual document. The books that I will make will never be used in the way that pre-industrial books were used, and that's part of the point. Nevertheless, there are many areas in which my aesthetic desires can be realized through pre-industrial techniques that were born of utilitarian necessities. Perhaps sizing after printing is one of these techniques, but after participating in the sizing process, it seems highly unlikely that post-printing sizing will become a standard operating procedure in my work, not to mention among book artists in general. But through experiments like Hungry Bibliophiles, it might be possible to develop working methods that are a little more durable by default, ones in which the utility can enhance rather than diminish the sensory experience of books. And so if you go to this website, you can see Tim Barrett and his crew try to make 2,000 sheets of handmade paper in a single day. They finally did it with 3 paper makers. But yeah, so this, even though I'm presenting this project, it simply wouldn't exist without Tim Barrett. So thank you.
So what did you do with all the paper you got from Czechoslovakia?
So, will you repeat the question in the microphone?
No. She asked, what did I do with the paper from Czechoslovakia, the Czech Republic.
Please excuse me.
I soaked it twice, dried it twice, and printed my book on it, and tried to recover.
Did it all work?
It all worked, yeah. Yeah, it worked beautifully. I mean, that's the problem, is that I can't hold it against the Velka-Lozany mill. I was able to get it to work. It had never occurred to me before that project. Before working on specimens, I had only printed on handmade paper made by Twin Rocker, J. Barcham Green, all of these places that made paper for book printers. And so I had never had to have a sizing conversation before. And so it was really my inexperience with buying handmade paper that led to the problem. The paper that Velka-Lozany made is beautiful. I mean, it's just, I just wish I hadn't bought it. But not even that, I love the book, and it led me to all these other things, so it did work.
Did Tim Barrett tell you what percentage of gelatin size he used in his sizing solution?
Yes, we used 3.5%.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. Which is a lot. I mean, this, people can handle, this is my and Annie's annotated book, which people can handle because it just doesn't, you can't harm it. It's just, I have a copy in my studio that just sits there, and every once in a while I just whack it against the table just to see, yeah. And there's no noticeable difference. Any other questions? Maria?
Can you pass that around for us to touch? Because I really would like to.
I think I'd prefer it if you came up and touched it. I don't want to pass it around. But
You don't have to pass it.
Are you selling any of the facsimiles?
The facsimiles are in print. The original book is not. Oh, she asked if I was selling any selling any of the facsimiles, and the facsimiles are in print, but the book the original book is not. So yes, I am. They're $50. Yeah. Yes, Rebecca.
What kind of paper do you use these days?
Well, I use a lot of different papers. I have been printing primarily on mold-made papers, but for my next big project, I just ordered a huge amount of paper from Twin Rocker. They've made a special formula for these prints that I want to do, and so when I work with handmade paper, I generally work with Twin Rocker. But I use Zirkel papers and Hanemula papers, and And I just bought this enormous stash of 100-year-old Kelmscott paper, so I'm going to do a book eventually on that. But, yeah. Talk about fear, exactly. Yeah. But, anyone else?
What was your favorite recipe?
But it's a tie. Dan DeSimone submitted Norma, his grandmother's pork neck ragu, which was amazing, and then Carolee Campbell's Grandma Tiggison's lamb shank stew was surprising. It really was. It was just fantastic. But there were a lot of good recipes. It turns out a lot of people who love books love food, and so there are actually a lot of good recipes in there. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. The original book, and you can come and paw it.
Not quite yet, because we
Okay.
have
Oh, right.
a final word and a chance for you to have a final word with Jennifer and Andrea. Where are you?
No, it's okay. I was going to thank you, but Alice stole all my material.
So just do it again.
So I'll do it again. I just wanted to thank our super smart curators and catalogers who advised us in so many ways. Working on the exhibit is what I mean. They helped us find things, they showed us potential materials to use in the exhibit, and explained context. They rapidly cataloged items before they went on the exhibit, and they read our label copy. And we couldn't ask for more knowledgeable and supportive coworkers. I wanted to thank Nicole Scalessa, who made our website. It went live today. So take a look at it. It's really great. The address is The Living Book, don't forget thelivingbook.librarycompany.org, or you could just go to the main website and click on the thing. And I wanted to thank Conchetta for the video. It's our first ever, live co-made video, so we're excited about that. And that's also on the website. That got loaded up today, so if you want to look at it again, it's on the website. Conchetta and Ariel Middleman do our social media, and so we actually have a hashtag for this exhibit, The Living Book, again, hashtag The Living Book. And we wanted to thank Claire. She's not even in the room, but she did all the legwork to make this event happen today. So, and after Andrea says a few words, we're going to have a reception, so I hope you'll stand up around and hang out with us a little longer.
Hi everybody, thank you all for being here, and thanks for making this such a great symposium, Mark and Russell and Alice. It was fabulous talks, and thanks everybody for coming. I just wanted to make a couple notes about putting this exhibit together. We've worked on this for just about a year. I think we might have started pulling our first batch of books last May. The three of us have worked together for 20 years, and as Jim said, we have a combined 87 years of experience taking care of the rare books at the library company. Along the way, we've made lots of interesting discoveries in the stacks, which we share excitedly with each other. And over the years, as Jim also said, stealing all of my thunder, we've compiled lists and lists of our secret and favorite, most precious little loves. As we started the process of choosing which books to exhibit, we returned to one guiding principle. We wanted to show books that, through their shape and size, through the materials they're made of, and through the traces of readership and use, demonstrate the book's utility and versatility, and show how the book has evolved to meet our changing needs. We also wanted to contextualize the exhibit within the digital age, where the discussion about how books serve us or not, becomes even more interesting. We had a great time collaborating. It was clear to us from the beginning that this would be a different kind of exhibit, one that reflected our knowledge and our way of learning. The living book is really an exercise in seeing, which is a natural extension of the way we conservators work with books. More than others, perhaps, we learn through looking and through making. Because we use our eyes and our hands to learn and understand, we are sensitive to processes of fabrication. By taking apart and reassembling, by examining and assessing materials and methods, we gain valuable information about the book, its cultural context, and its unique history as it's passed from hand to hand across time. We focus on the stuff of the book and what can be learned through a close reading of its forms and materials. Above all, we wanted to make every section a delight and a joy to look at and share our enthusiasm and spark discussion and curiosity about the book. Thank you for being here. We invite you to enjoy the reception and then feast your eyes on the living book.
There's a reception in there, and gallery in there.
And Russell comes up here. Mr. Paul.
I would work.